I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard the knock on my door that would turn my peaceful Tuesday into a legal nightmare involving property lines, fake surveys, and the most vindictive woman I'd ever met in my life. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with Deborah Hartwick, the president of the Meadowbrook Springs Homeowners Association in Phoenix, Arizona. She was a woman in her late 40s with hair the color of processed wheat and a smile that could freeze antifreeze. Behind her stood some guy in a reflective vest holding what looked like surveying equipment, and another woman I recognized as Patricia Greenfield, the HOA secretary, clutching a tablet to her chest like it was a sacred text. Yannick Delacroix, Deborah said my name like it tasted bad. We need to discuss your shed. I blinked at her. My shed? The one that's been sitting in my backyard for the last 20 years. That shed, she confirmed, her voice dripping with false sweetness, is actually on my property. According to our recent survey, your structure encroaches on my lot by approximately 6 feet. I'm going to need you to remove it within 30 days, or the HOA will be forced to take action. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of the statement hit me like a physical thing. Deborah, that shed has been there since 2006. I built it the same year I moved into this house. You moved in 3 years ago. Nevertheless, she said, adjusting her designer sunglasses, the survey doesn't lie. Carl here is a licensed surveyor and his findings are conclusive. The shed sits on what is legally my property, and I want it removed. Carl, the surveyor, looked distinctly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot and wouldn't quite meet my eyes. That was my first clue something was seriously wrong with this whole situation. Can I see this survey? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger starting to bubble up in my chest. Patricia stepped forward and turned her tablet toward me. On the screen was a property map that showed my lot and Deborah's lot next door. Sure enough, a red line indicated that my shed crossed over into what was marked as her property. But something about it looked off. The angle wasn't quite right, and the measurements seemed to show my entire property shifted about 10 feet from where I knew it actually was. This is wrong, I said flatly. My property extends to that row of cottonwood trees, always has. I have the original survey from when I bought the house. Old surveys can be inaccurate, Deborah said with that shark smile again. Technology has improved significantly. Carl's equipment is state-of-the-art. I'm afraid you're going to have to accept reality, Yannick. The reality, I said, is that you've wanted my shed gone ever since you moved in because you think it blocks your view of the mountain. This is just the latest scheme. Her smile tightened. This is not a scheme. This is a property rights issue. You have 30 days, as per HOA Regulations Section 7.3, which states that any structure found to be in violation of property boundaries must be removed or relocated at the owner's expense. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $250, and the HOA reserves the right to remove the structure and bill you for the cost. Section 7.3 was added last year, I pointed out. My shed predates that rule by almost 2 decades. Rules apply to all structures regardless of when they were built, Patricia chimed in, her voice mousy but certain. The HOA board voted on this unanimously. Of course you did, I muttered, because Deborah controls the board. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that slanderous comment, Deborah said, her voice going cold. 30 days, Yannick, starting today. You'll receive formal notice in the mail by end of business tomorrow. They left, Carl practically scurrying away like he couldn't escape fast enough. I stood on my porch, coffee forgotten, staring at the shed in question. It was a solid structure, 12 by 16 feet, with cedar siding that I'd stained myself. I used it as a workshop for my woodworking hobby. I had tools in there worth thousands of dollars, not to mention the projects I was in the middle of completing. The idea of tearing it down or moving it was absolutely absurd, especially when I knew for a fact it was on my property. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor on the other side, Martin Chen. Martin had lived in Meadowbrook Springs longer than anyone, a retired civil engineer who'd watched the neighborhood grow from a small development of 30 homes to a sprawling community of over 200. "Martin, I need your help," I said when he answered. "Deborah is claiming my shed is on her property." "That shed's been there since before she even moved in," Martin said immediately. "That's ridiculous. She has a survey that supposedly proves it. Can you come over?" "I need someone else to look at this." Martin arrived 15 minutes later, his own survey equipment in hand. He might have been retired, but he'd kept his tools and his knowledge sharp. We spent the next hour in my backyard while Martin took measurements, checked property markers, and compared everything to the documentation I'd pulled from my filing cabinet, the original survey from 2006, when I'd purchased the house. "This is exactly what I thought," Martin said finally, standing up and brushing dirt off his knees. "Your property line is right where it's supposed to be. That row of cottonwood trees marks the boundary. Your shed is a good 4 feet inside your own lot. There's no encroachment whatsoever." "So Deborah's survey is fake?" "I wouldn't say fake necessarily," Martin said carefully, "but it's definitely wrong. Either that surveyor made serious errors or he was told to produce specific results. You see this corner pin here?" He pointed to a metal stake in the ground near the trees. "This is the original property marker. It's been here since this development was first plotted in 1998. Carl's survey apparently ignored it completely." "What do I do?" I asked, frustration and anger mixing in equal parts. "Get your own survey," Martin said. "Use someone who has no connection to Deborah or the HOA. Document everything. And I'd suggest talking to a property attorney, because if Deborah is pushing this hard, she's not going to back down just because you present facts. I've seen her operate. She gets an idea in her head and she pursues it like a bulldog." I thanked Martin and immediately started making calls. The first was to Henderson and Associates, a surveying company based in Scottsdale that had excellent reviews and no connection to Meadowbrook Springs. They could send someone out in 3 days. The second call was to James Richardson, a real estate attorney whose name I'd gotten from a colleague at work. His receptionist scheduled me for a consultation the following afternoon. The formal notice arrived by certified mail the next morning, just as Deborah had promised. It was even worse than I'd expected. The letter outlined not just the demand to remove the shed, but also included a bill for $1,200. What they claimed was the cost of the survey they'd commissioned. According to their logic, since the survey revealed my violation, I should pay for it. The letter was signed by all 5 board members, though I knew for a fact that 3 of them were just rubber stamps for whatever Deborah wanted. At work that day, I couldn't concentrate. I taught history at Desert Vista High School, and my students definitely noticed my distraction. During lunch, I sat in my classroom and researched Arizona property law, adverse possession, and HOA regulations until my eyes crossed. The meeting with James Richardson gave me both hope and dread. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. After I explained the situation and showed him all my documentation, including photos of the property markers and Martin's measurements, he leaned back in his chair. "This is harassment," he said bluntly, "and possibly fraud, depending on what that surveyor actually did. But here's the thing, Yannick. Fighting this is going to cost you money and time. The HOA has a legal fund they can draw on, funded by everyone's dues. They can drag this out for months, even years, and it won't cost Deborah personally a dime. You, on the other hand, will be paying out of pocket for every hour I work on this. How much are we talking? Depends on how far it goes. A few thousand at minimum. Could be 10 or 15,000 if it ends up in court, though I don't think it would get that far. The problem is that Deborah knows most people will give in rather than fight because of the cost and hassle. It's a calculated strategy. I'm not most people, I said. That shed stays. James smiled slightly. Good. Then here's what we do. First, we get your independent survey done. Second, we file a response to the HOA's notice disputing their findings and their demand. Third, we send a letter to Carl Murphy, that surveyor, requesting all of his field notes and methodology. If he's done something improper, we'll find it. Fourth, we research whether Deborah has done this to anyone else in the community. If there's a pattern of harassment, that strengthens your position considerably. She tried to force the Millers to repaint their house 2 years ago, I said, remembering. Said their beige was the wrong shade of beige. They ended up selling and moving rather than deal with her. See if you can get them to provide a statement about that, James said. Start building a file. Document every interaction with Deborah, every letter, every conversation. If she comes to your property, record it if Arizona's recording laws allow it, which they do since it's single-party consent here. I left his office feeling slightly better but also aware that I was in for a long fight. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The independent surveyor, a woman named Lisa Fernandez, came out and spent 6 hours meticulously measuring every inch of my property. She found exactly what Martin had found. The original property markers were still in place, and my shed was completely within my lot boundaries. I can't speak to what Carl Murphy was doing, Lisa said as she packed up her equipment, but his survey is incorrect. These pins don't lie. They're the original markers, they're in the right positions according to the development's master plan, and everything checks out. Your shed is fine. Can you put that in writing? I'll have a full report for you by Friday, she said. With photographs, measurements, and a detailed site map. You can use it however you need to. Armed with Lisa's report, James sent a formal response to the HOA, along with copies to all 5 board members individually. The letter was a masterpiece of legal language that essentially said my shed wasn't going anywhere. Their survey was wrong, and any attempt to fine or take action against me would result in immediate legal action for harassment and slander of title. Deborah's response came within 24 hours, but not in the form I expected. Instead of a letter, she showed up at my house at 7 in the evening with a Phoenix police officer in tow. Officer Morrison, she said, her voice dripping with false concern, this is the man I told you about. He's been threatening me. I stared at her in disbelief. What are you talking about, Officer Morrison? A young guy who looked barely out of the academy held up a hand. Sir, I need to hear from you. Madam Hartwick claims you've been sending her threatening messages and making harassing phone calls. That's a complete lie, I said. I haven't called her once. The only communication has been through lawyers. Officer, this is a property dispute. She's trying to force me to remove a shed that's been on my property for 20 years, and when I got evidence proving it's on my land, she's now making false accusations. You have proof of these threats, madam? Officer Morrison asked Deborah. I have a witness who heard him yelling at me when we came to deliver the notice, she said. And I've received several disturbing phone calls from a blocked number. The voice sounded like his. Who's your witness? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Patricia Greenfield can testify to your aggressive behavior. I wasn't aggressive. I was standing on my own porch when you showed up uninvited to make false claims about my property, and I have never called you from any number, blocked or otherwise. Officer, I'm happy to provide my phone records." Officer Morrison looked between us, clearly realizing he'd been called into the middle of a civil dispute. "Sir, do you have a lawyer?" "I do, James Richardson." "Madam, this sounds like a civil matter. If you feel threatened, you can file for a restraining order through the courts, but I can't arrest someone based on accusations without evidence. And sir, if you're not making threats or contact, keep it that way. Let the lawyers handle it." After the officer left, with Deborah shooting me a triumphant look like she'd won something, I immediately called James and left a voicemail explaining what had happened. He called back within the hour, furious. "That's witness intimidation," he said. "She's trying to build a false narrative that you're unstable or threatening. Don't engage with her at all anymore. Every single interaction goes through me, and we're going to file a formal complaint about this stunt." The next week brought escalation after escalation. I received another letter from the HOA claiming that the daily fines had started, even though my 30 days weren't up, and I'd provided proof the shed was on my property. The bill was already at $1,750 for 7 days. Then someone spray-painted "Move the shed" on my driveway in bright orange paint. I had no proof it was Deborah, but the timing was awfully convenient. I filed a police report and installed security cameras around my property that same day. The cameras proved their worth almost immediately. 2 days after installation, they caught Patricia Greenfield walking through my backyard at 11 at night, taking pictures of the shed with her phone. When I showed the footage to James, he immediately sent a cease and desist letter to both Patricia and the HOA, warning that any further trespassing would result in criminal charges. But Deborah wasn't done. The next HOA meeting, which was open to all residents, became a spectacle. I attended with Martin as my witness, and James came as well. The meeting was held in the community center, a generic building with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs where about 40 residents had gathered. Deborah ran the meeting like a dictator. She steamrolled through the normal business, approving meeting minutes, discussing the budget, and then got to what she clearly considered the main event. "We need to address a serious issue of community standards," she announced, her voice carrying through the room. "One of our residents, Yannick Delacroix, has an illegal structure on his property that violates boundary lines. Despite being formally notified and given opportunity to correct the violation, he has refused to comply. The board moves to authorize the HOA to remove the structure at his expense and to place a lien on his property for all associated costs and fines." Several people murmured. Some looked at me with curiosity, others with disapproval. I stood up. "I'd like to address that," I said. "You're not on the agenda," Deborah said coldly. "This concerns me directly. I have a right to speak." James stood as well. As the HOA's own bylaws state, any resident has the right to address the board regarding actions that directly affect their property. "You need to let him speak, or this entire meeting could be invalidated." Deborah's jaw tightened, but she gestured curtly. 5 minutes. I walked to the front of the room, my hands full of documentation. "The shed in question has been on my property since 2006, almost 20 years. It was built with proper permits from the city of Phoenix. The HOA is claiming it violates property boundaries based on a survey commissioned by Deborah Hartwick. However, I have commissioned my own survey from an independent, licensed surveyor, and that survey confirms what I've always known: the shed is completely within my property boundaries. The original property markers are still in place and prove this conclusively." I held up Lisa's report. I have photographs, measurements, and detailed documentation. The HOA's survey is simply wrong. Furthermore, the rule being cited, Section 7.3, was only implemented last year. There's no grandfather clause being applied to existing structures, which raises serious questions about selective enforcement. Finally, I want this community to know that Deborah Hartwick has engaged in harassment, false police reports, and trespassing on my property. I have video evidence of HOA representatives on my land without permission in the middle of the night. The murmuring grew louder. I saw several people whispering to each other, and more than a few were looking at Deborah with surprise or suspicion. "Those are serious accusations," Deborah said, her face flushing red, "and completely false." "I have documentation for everything," I said calmly, "and I've provided copies to my attorney. The HOA is welcome to review my independent survey at any time. If the board proceeds with this action, knowing that the basis for it is factually wrong, then every board member will be personally liable for harassment and abuse of their positions." James stood again. "I represent Mr. Delacroix, and I want to make it clear that any action taken against his property will result in immediate legal action. Furthermore, we will be investigating the surveyor who produced the initial report for the HOA. If it's found that he falsified data or was improperly influenced, we'll be pursuing both civil and criminal charges." The room erupted in conversation. Several people were clearly on my side now, including a woman named Rosa Martinez who stood up and said loudly, "I want to see both surveys. This sounds like the board is overreaching, and I don't like the idea of them having the power to just tear down structures that have been there for years." Another resident, Tom Prakish, added, "I remember when Yannick built that shed. I helped him pour the foundation. It was definitely on his property. We were careful about it." Deborah tried to regain control of the meeting, but it had slipped away from her. The vote she wanted to take was tabled by a motion from the floor, something I hadn't even known was possible. But Martin had apparently come prepared and knew the parliamentary procedure inside and out. The board was forced to agree to review both surveys before any action could be taken. Leaving the meeting, I felt like I'd won a small victory, but James warned me not to get too confident. "She's going to escalate again," he said. "People like Deborah don't back down. They double down. Watch yourself." He was right. 3 days later, I woke up to find that someone had scattered nails across my driveway. 2 of my tires were punctured before I noticed. The security cameras showed a figure in a hoodie approaching around 3 in the morning, but the face was obscured. I couldn't prove it was Deborah or anyone she'd sent, but I filed another police report. The next incident was worse. I came home from work to find that someone had broken into my shed. The lock had been cut clean through with bolt cutters. Nothing was missing, but someone had rifled through everything, leaving tools scattered and projects damaged. Several pieces of furniture I'd been working on, including a dining table I'd spent months crafting for a client, had been deliberately scratched and gouged. This time, the security cameras caught something useful. Not the break-in itself, which had happened during a 2-hour window when I'd been at work, and there was a camera blind spot near the shed's door, but the departure. A white SUV left my driveway at 2:15 in the afternoon, and while I couldn't see the driver, I could see the license plate. It took the police all of an hour to trace it to a vehicle registered to Patricia Greenfield. When the police questioned her, Patricia broke down almost immediately. She admitted to breaking into the shed, but claimed Deborah had told her it was legal since the shed was supposedly on disputed property. She'd been told to look for any documentation that might prove I'd known about the boundary issue when I built the shed, anything that could be used against me. When she hadn't found anything, she'd gotten angry and damaged my projects out of frustration. Patricia was arrested for criminal trespassing and criminal damage. The charges were serious enough that she was looking at potential jail time. And more importantly, she was willing to talk. In her statement to police, which James was able to obtain through discovery, Patricia revealed that Deborah had orchestrated the entire scheme. Deborah wanted my shed gone because she believed it lowered her property value and blocked her mountain view. She'd approached Carl Murphy, the surveyor, and specifically told him what results she wanted. Carl had initially refused, but Deborah had apparently found out he'd been in trouble with the state licensing board a few years earlier for some minor violations. She'd threatened to make a new complaint and drag his name through the mud unless he produced a survey showing the shed encroached on her property. Carl, facing the potential loss of his license and livelihood, had caved. He'd produced a survey that deliberately misplaced the property markers and shifted the boundary lines. He'd known it was wrong, which explained his uncomfortable demeanor when they'd first come to my door. With Patricia's statement, James moved quickly. We filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board against Carl Murphy, along with a criminal complaint for fraud. We also filed a civil suit against Deborah for harassment, trespassing, fraud, property damage, and about 6 other causes of action. The case against Carl moved faster than I expected. The licensing board suspended him pending investigation, and when they reviewed his survey against Lisa's, the discrepancies were obvious. Carl, facing the end of his career and possible criminal charges, decided to cooperate fully. He provided emails and text messages from Deborah that made her intent crystal clear. In one message, she'd written, "I don't care what you have to do, I want that shed shown as being on my property. Find a way to make the numbers work." That was enough for the police to arrest Deborah. I was at school when it happened, but Martin called me immediately to tell me he'd seen police cars at her house. By the time I got home, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Deborah had been charged with fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and several related offenses. Her bail was set at $50,000. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and, facing massive liability and the threat of lawsuits from other residents, who were now questioning every decision Deborah had pushed through, they voted unanimously to remove her as president. They also formally apologized to me and rescinded all fines and demands related to the shed, but the legal process was far from over. Deborah hired an expensive attorney and fought the charges. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for late March, about 6 weeks after her arrest. In the meantime, I had to deal with the civil case, which was proceeding on its own track. Deborah's attorney tried to settle early, offering to pay for the repairs to my shed and my legal fees if I would drop the civil suit. James advised me to reject it, and I did. The property damage was minimal compared to the months of harassment, stress, and fear I'd endured. I wanted accountability. As we approached the preliminary hearing for the criminal case, more evidence came out. Carl Murphy, as part of his cooperation agreement with prosecutors, revealed that Deborah had done this before. Not with property surveys, but with other fraudulent schemes to force residents to bend to her will. She'd falsified complaints about noise, claimed health code violations that didn't exist, and even tried to have one resident's dog declared dangerous through fabricated incident reports. The prosecutors were now investigating at least 3 other cases where Deborah had abused her position as HOA president. The criminal trial itself was scheduled for June, which meant months of waiting. But the civil case moved forward. We entered mediation in April, sitting in a conference room with a mediator while Deborah and her attorney sat on one side of the table and James and I sat on the other. Deborah looked older than when I'd first seen her at my door. The stress had clearly taken its toll. Her face was drawn, her hair not as perfectly styled, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. The mediator, a retired judge named Kenneth Torres, reviewed the case and then looked directly at Deborah. "Madam, I'm going to be blunt with you. Your position here is untenable. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The criminal case is going to proceed regardless of what happens here. Your best option is to settle this civil matter favorably and minimize your financial exposure." Deborah's attorney, a slick guy in an expensive suit named Marcus Powell, cleared his throat. "My client is prepared to offer $100,000 to settle all claims, along with a formal written apology and an agreement not to contact Mr. Delacroix again." I looked at James. We discussed this beforehand. A settlement would mean certainty and closure. A trial could drag on for years and might result in less money or more, depending on a jury. But it would also keep me tied to this nightmare indefinitely. $150,000, James said. Plus a public statement to the HOA community acknowledging the wrongdoing. And she pays for a new survey of the entire neighborhood to ensure no other property markers have been tampered with or misidentified. Marcus conferred with Deborah in whispers. She looked like she wanted to argue but finally nodded. "We can agree to $125,000 and the public statement," Marcus said. "The neighborhood survey is too broad. My client shouldn't be responsible for that." We went back and forth for another hour. Eventually, we settled at $135,000, a formal public apology to be read at the next HOA meeting by Deborah herself, and payment of all my legal fees, which by that point had climbed to nearly $20,000. Deborah also agreed to resign from any position with the HOA and to never run for the board again. The settlement was finalized in early May. The criminal trial was still looming, scheduled to start in mid-June. I'd been subpoenaed as a witness, along with Martin, Lisa the surveyor, and about a dozen other people from the neighborhood. The day I had to testify was surreal. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, and less dramatic than what you see on television. The prosecutor, a serious woman in her 30s named Angela Reeves, walked me through the entire timeline from the moment Deborah had appeared at my door to the discovery of the fraud. Deborah's defense attorney tried to make it seem like she'd simply made a mistake, that she genuinely believed the shed was on her property based on Carl's survey, and that she'd had no intent to defraud anyone. But the text messages and emails destroyed that argument. The jury heard her own words telling Carl to falsify the survey results. They heard Patricia's testimony about being told to break into my shed. They saw the pattern of harassment and intimidation. The trial lasted a week. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Deborah was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and several other charges. Her sentencing was scheduled for August. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery with Martin and several other neighbors who'd been affected by Deborah's actions over the years. The judge, a stern woman named Helen Kowalski, reviewed the presentence report and then looked down at Deborah, who stood at the defense table looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. "Miss Hartwick," Judge Kowalski said, "you held a position of trust in your community. People relied on you to act in their best interests, to be fair and honest in your administration of the homeowners association. Instead, you abused that trust repeatedly and systematically. You engaged in fraud, you suborned perjury, You harassed your neighbors, and you showed no remorse until you were caught. The damage you've done to this community goes beyond any single victim. You've destroyed trust, created fear, and cost people significant amounts of money and peace of mind. I take these offenses very seriously. She sentenced Deborah to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She also ordered restitution to be paid to all victims, including the full amount of the civil settlement with me. Additionally, she placed Deborah on 5 years of probation after her release, during which time she would be prohibited from serving on any HOA board or community organization in a leadership capacity. Deborah was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice had been done, but sadness that it had come to this at all. If she'd just been reasonable, if she'd accepted that my shed was on my property and left it alone, none of this would have happened. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The HOA elected a new board, including Rosa Martinez as president. She was fair, reasonable, and transparent in a way Deborah never had been. One of her first acts was to commission that neighborhood-wide survey to verify all property boundaries, which came out of the HOA's reserves rather than individual homeowners' pockets. My property was confirmed exactly as I'd always known it to be. Carl Murphy lost his surveying license permanently and pleaded guilty to fraud charges. He received probation and community service, having cooperated extensively with prosecutors. Patricia Greenfield pleaded guilty to the break-in charges and received a suspended sentence, along with probation and anger management counseling. I repaired the damage to my shed and finished the dining table I'd been working on, though it took longer than expected. My client was understanding when I explained what had happened, especially after the story made local news. Actually, the publicity ended up being good for my woodworking business. Several people reached out asking me to build custom pieces, saying they admired how I'd stood up to bullying and intimidation. The settlement money, after taxes, was enough to pay off my mortgage and put a significant amount into savings. I used some of it to upgrade my workshop equipment and donated a portion to a legal aid fund that helped homeowners fight unfair HOA actions. I'd learned firsthand how expensive it could be to defend your rights, and I wanted to help others who might not have the resources I'd had. Martin and I became closer friends through the ordeal. We started having weekly dinners, trading stories and laughing about some of the more absurd moments of the whole situation. Like the time Deborah had tried to claim my shed was a safety hazard because it might attract termites, even though it was cedar wood that termites don't like. Or when she'd sent me a letter demanding I painted a different color to match her house, as if my shed had anything to do with her property at all. One warm evening in October, almost a year after Deborah had first knocked on my door, I was in my backyard grilling dinner. The shed stood exactly where it had always stood, solid and undisturbed. The setting sun painted the mountains in the distant shades of orange and purple that view Deborah had been so obsessed with. I could see it just fine from my porch. So could she from hers. The shed had never blocked anything except her bizarre vendetta. My phone rang. It was James Richardson. "Just wanted to let you know," he said. "Deborah Hartwick was denied parole. She'll serve at least another 6 months before she can apply again." "How do you feel about that?" I asked. "Honestly, I think the sentence was fair. She needed to understand the consequences of her actions." "How are you doing?" "I'm good," I said and meant it. "Really good, actually. The whole thing was awful while it was happening, but I'm glad I fought back. If I'd just given in and torn down the shed, she would have just moved on to tormenting someone else." "That's exactly right," James said. You did the neighborhood a favor, even if it cost you time and stress. Speaking of which, I'm closing out my files on your case. Final bill is in the mail, but it should be minimal since the settlement covered most of it. After we hung up, I stood in my backyard for a while, just breathing in the desert air and feeling grateful. Grateful for Martin's help, for James's expertise, for Lisa's thorough survey work, for the neighbors who'd spoken up at that community meeting. Grateful that I lived in a place where the legal system, for all its flaws, had ultimately worked the way it was supposed to. The shed would stay right where it was, probably for another 20 years or more. It was solid, well-built, and completely legal. And every time I looked at it, I'd remember that sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when it's difficult and expensive and scary. Because your home is your home, and no one, not even a HOA Karen with delusions of power, has the right to take that away from you based on lies and manufactured evidence. I went back to my grill, flipped the chicken, and smiled. Life in Meadowbrook Springs was peaceful again, the way it should be. The mountains stood eternal in the distance. The desert bloomed with late-season flowers, and my shed, that wonderful, contentious, perfectly legal shed, sat exactly where it belonged on my property, where it had been all along. The legal battle had taught me valuable lessons about standing up for yourself, about the importance of documentation, and about how power can corrupt even the smallest positions of authority. It had also taught me about community, about the good people who stand up when they see injustice, and about the legal system's ability to correct wrongs when good people engage with it. The story spread through Phoenix's HOA communities, becoming something of a cautionary tale. I'd been contacted by several local news outlets, and a reporter from the Arizona Republic wrote a feature article about HOA abuses and how homeowners could protect themselves. The article quoted James extensively and used my case as the centerpiece example. Several state legislators even mentioned it when proposing new laws to reform HOA governance and provide better oversight. I never set out to become some kind of homeowner rights advocate, but that's what happened. I started speaking at community meetings when invited, sharing my story and offering advice to people facing similar situations. The most important thing I told them was always the same: document everything, get independent verification of any claims made against you, and don't be afraid to lawyer up if necessary. HOAs count on people being too intimidated or too cheap to fight back. When you do fight back with facts and the law on your side, they usually fold. There was something deeply satisfying about taking that terrible experience and turning it into something positive. Every person I helped avoid a similar situation, every homeowner who stood up to unfair HOA practices because they'd heard my story, made the whole ordeal feel worthwhile. Rosa Martinez turned out to be an excellent HOA president. Under her leadership, the board revised the bylaws to include better protections for homeowners, mandatory review periods before any enforcement action, and a requirement that all surveys or inspections be done by independent parties with no connection to any board member. They also implemented a conflict of interest policy that would have prevented Deborah from pursuing her vendetta against me in the first place. The neighborhood itself became stronger. People were more engaged, more willing to attend meetings and speak up. The culture of fear that Deborah had created evaporated, replaced by a genuine sense of community. Block parties became regular events. People looked out for each other. It was everything a homeowners association was supposed to be: a group of neighbors working together to maintain and improve their community, not a dictatorship run by someone with too much time and too much anger. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Deborah had knocked on my door, Martin organized a backyard party at my place. About 30 neighbors showed up, bringing food and drinks and good humor. Someone had even made a cake decorated with a little fondant shed on top. We laughed about it, toasted to good neighbors and strong property markers, and enjoyed the perfect Arizona evening. Tom Prakish, who'd spoken up at that contentious HOA meeting, pulled me aside at one point. "You know what I respect most about how you handled all this," he said. "You never got mean. You never tried to destroy Deborah just for the sake of destroying her. You just defended what was yours and let the system work. That takes real character." I was angry enough at times, I admitted. There were moments I wanted to make her life miserable the way she was making mine miserable. But that wouldn't have accomplished anything except making me into the person she was pretending I was. "Exactly," Tom said. "You took the high road and it paid off. You won, she lost, and justice was served. That's how it's supposed to work." As the party wound down and people started heading home, I found myself back in my usual spot, standing on my porch with a beer in hand, looking at the shed. It really was just a shed, nothing special, just a place to store tools and work on projects. But it had become a symbol of something more important, the principle that your property rights matter, that the truth matters, and that ordinary people can stand up to bullies and win. The shed would need a new coat of stain in another year or two. The wood was holding up well, but the Arizona sun was brutal on everything eventually. I'd probably do it in the spring, when the weather was perfect for that kind of work. And I'd take my time, do it right, make sure it lasted another 20 years, because that shed wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever. It was mine on my land, built with my own hands and defended with every ounce of determination I had. Deborah had tried to take it away based on lies and fraud, and she'd lost everything in the attempt. I'd protected what was mine, and in the process, helped protect the whole community from her abuse. The mountains in the distance were silhouettes now, the sun having fully set. Stars were starting to appear in the darkening sky. The desert night was coming alive with its particular sounds and rhythms. And my shed, that perfectly ordinary, perfectly legal, perfectly positioned shed, sat quiet and solid in the gathering darkness, exactly where it belonged. I finished my beer, locked up the shed one more time, and headed inside. Tomorrow was a school day and I had lesson plans to review. Life went on, normal and peaceful and good. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served, and I had my property, my shed, and my peace of mind back. Sometimes standing up for yourself is hard. Sometimes it costs money and time and causes stress you never wanted. But sometimes it's absolutely necessary. And when you do it for the right reasons, when you fight for truth and justice rather than ego or revenge, good things can happen. The system can work. The bad guys can lose. And you can sleep at night knowing you did the right thing. That was worth more than any shed, any property, any amount of money. The knowledge that when tested I'd stood firm, I'd done what was right, and I'd won.